Isabella Cruz carried the weight of 1,000 silent battles etched into the very fabric of her skin, scars tracing maps of pain, resilience, and survival. Each mark told a story, not just of flesh torn and healed, but of memories that refused to fade, of moments suspended in the chaos of war where fear and courage intertwined in a delicate, deadly dance. She was no stranger to pain, but what haunted her most wasn't the physical wounds. It was the invisible fractures within her soul, the relentless echo of loss, sacrifice, and the unbearable burden of living when so many had died. Before the worn apron and the modest smile she now wore daily at May's diner, Isabella had been something different, a healer amidst the roar of gunfire, a beacon of hope in the darkest hours on the battlefield. As a combat nurse with the United States Marine Corps, she was trained not just to patch wounds, but to hold lives in her trembling hands, to cradle fragile hope when the world was collapsing. She had seen the worst of humanity in war's merciless grip, the screams, the blood, the desperation, but also the unwavering spirit that refused to yield. It was there, in the dust and the fire, that she had learned the true cost of survival. Her hands bore scars from shrapnel, her face marked by a burn from an explosion that had taken the life of the young soldier she had sworn to protect. In that instant, when the world went silent except for the pounding in her ears, she had felt the hollow ache of helplessness, an agony far deeper than any physical pain. The medals she earned, including the Purple Heart, were symbols of valor, but to Isabella, they were reminders of those she could not save, ghosts of comrades whose faces haunted her dreams. She carried their memories with a sacred tenderness, the weight of guilt mingled with pride, and the quiet question that never ceased to torment her: why her and not them? Returning home had not been a relief, but a new kind of battle. The scars that marked her skin were visible, but the wounds within were invisible to most, misunderstood or ignored. Society saw only the broken exterior, a woman changed, hardened, somehow other. Job interviews became interrogations, sympathy twisted into suspicion, and respect into pity. The world she once fought to protect now turned its back on her, as if the price she paid was too high to acknowledge. But Isabella bore it all with a quiet dignity, a resilience forged in the crucible of war. Now, at May's diner, amidst the clatter of dishes and the low murmur of everyday life, she moved through her days like a shadow of her former self, present, yet distant, serving meals with hands that once saved lives, her eyes reflecting the silent stories she never shared. Each scar was a testament, a chapter of a story few wanted to hear, yet one she could never forget. Beneath the surface of this ordinary existence pulsed the extraordinary courage of a woman who had faced death and returned, forever changed but unbroken. Certainly. Here is the continuation of Isabella Cruz's story, focusing on the discrimination and mockery she faces, told in a continuous, psychologically rich narrative style. They never said it outright, at least not at first. The looks were subtle, the kind that lingered a second too long, brows twitching in restrained judgment as their gaze caught the puckered lines that curled across the side of her neck, vanishing into the collar of her uniform. Some whispered, some smirked behind coffee cups, and some, often the boldest of cowards, let their contempt slip through passive-aggressive comments, polished with mock concern or wrapped in awkward laughter. It wasn't the scars that unsettled them. It was the reminder of something they preferred to forget, that war was real, that it left marks, and that sometimes it came home walking upright in the shape of a woman like Isabella. In the early days at May's diner, she had tried to meet the world with calm resilience. She kept her voice gentle, her movements precise, her expressions carefully measured. But no amount of grace could shield her from the cruelty of people who mistook difference for defect. Some customers refused to make eye contact, placing their orders with clipped tones and hurried gestures, as if speaking to her might contaminate their comfort. Others leaned back in their booths, eyes scanning her scars as if tracing the lines of a freak show exhibit, and whispered in low voices about that one who came back from over there, the way they might speak of a storm that passed but left damage in its wake. Then came the laughter. the cruel kind that echoed louder in silence than in sound. A group of teenagers once mimicked the way she limped when her hip flared up from an old injury, each step exaggerated like a parody of pain. They didn't know that the limp came from dragging a bleeding man across the sand while gunfire rained down, her body screaming but her grip refusing to let go. They didn't care. They only saw the twitch in her stride, the strange tension in her hands, the tightness in her jaw when the diner's bell chimed too sharply, signs of trauma that they mistook for awkwardness, or worse, weakness. One night, after the last customer had left and the scent of grease and coffee still lingered in the air, Isabella stood in the back room, her hands gripping the sink until her knuckles paled. The laughter from earlier that day still echoed in her ears. A customer had joked that she looked like she'd been barbecued and left out in the rain. He'd said it to his buddy, not directly to her, but loud enough. Her breath hitched, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. Because no matter how many shifts she worked, no matter how many smiles she offered, she could never quite scrub off the invisible dirt people threw at her. She was clean, but not clean enough. Brave, but not palatable. Female, but too broken for their comfort. Even some of the townsfolk who praised her service in the military couldn't help themselves. "You were so brave," they'd say, their eyes full of pity, not respect. "But you must have seen some terrible things. No wonder you're like this." As if bravery had a limit. As if surviving made her unstable. As if being like this meant she should have stayed overseas, buried quietly alongside the ones who never came back. The worst part wasn't the words. It was how they eroded her sense of self, slowly, day after day. Mockery doesn't always come with shouting. It creeps in, seeps through cracks, settles in the marrow. It made her question whether she truly belonged anywhere, whether she would ever be more than a relic of war to the world around her. And yet, even in the darkest moments, she endured, not because she wanted to prove them wrong, but because giving in would be letting them define her, and that, after everything, was one thing she refused to surrender. So, she put on the uniform, tied her apron, and met the world with quiet defiance. Behind the worn counter of May's diner, Isabella Cruz stood every day as a living contradiction, scarred but not defeated, broken but still whole in a way no one else seemed to understand. And as the laughter faded into memory, as the whispers dulled into background noise, something stronger remained, a quiet strength, forged in fire, that no one could mock away. At first, Isabella tried to let it slide, let the laughter pass, let the sneers fall to the floor like dirty water she would mop up at the end of her shift. But every time someone turned away too quickly, every time they flinched at the sight of her scars as if they could catch something from them, it dug a little deeper. She didn't respond with anger. She didn't lash out. That wasn't her way. Anger was easy. Control was harder. And control was the only thing that had kept her alive, both on the battlefield and here, in this smaller, quieter war. Still, even steel bends under pressure. One morning, after a man joked that she looked like a villain from a war movie, Isabella dropped the coffee pot. It didn't shatter, but the clatter drew every eye in the diner. For a second, she stood frozen, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the rage she kept locked behind her ribs like a snarling animal. She didn't say anything. She just picked up the pot, turned on her heel, and disappeared into the back. Some customers exchanged glances. Others smirked as if they'd just confirmed something they'd long suspected. But not all of them. That afternoon, when she returned from the break room, face composed but pale, eyes a little too quiet, old Marlene, who always ordered tea with lemon and wore her late husband's flannel shirts, slid her a folded napkin. Isabella opened it later and found just 2 words written in shaky penmanship: "They're cowards." And beneath it, a small heart. There were others, too, who noticed, not just the cruelty, but how she bore it. Charlie, a retired mechanic who always sat at the end booth and never said much, started leaving her tips that didn't make sense for the meals he ordered. A 5 for toast. A 10 for black coffee. One day, without looking up from his plate, he muttered, You carry more dignity in your limp than those boys do in their Sunday suits. It was rough, clumsy praise, but it landed with weight. The small acts didn't erase the wounds, but they stitched around the edges. Recognition, not the pitying kind, but the kind that came from people who had lived enough to know pain when they saw it, and to respect someone who didn't wear theirs like a cry for attention, but like a badge of survival. Still, Isabella's own reactions were more complex than anything said to her. She battled herself more than she ever battled them. There were days when she wanted to scream, to throw plates, to ask why decency had to be a one-sided burden. But she didn't. Instead, she woke up early and ran before the sun rose, pounding her feet into the gravel like she could grind out the shame others tried to plant in her. She meditated, lit candles she never admitted to anyone, breathed like she was still under fire, training herself not to flinch. She talked to no one about the nights. About how the silence echoed worse than gunfire. About how even kindness sometimes cut, because it reminded her of the years when she had comrades who never let her feel alone, who joked even while bleeding, who made her believe she was more than what the world now saw. The faces at the diner weren't those faces. They didn't know who she'd been, only what she looked like now. And yet, the regulars began to shift, in their own quiet way. They watched how she greeted every customer the same, how she never turned away from ugliness, how she refilled coffee with a calmness that was its own form of defiance. Some began to see not just the scars, but the hands that carried the tray without a shake, the eyes that stayed clear even when insulted. Respect grew slowly, like moss, quiet, unnoticed until one day it covered everything. One evening, a new customer started laughing at her scars. No cruelty, just careless ignorance. But before Isabella could speak, before she could reach for patience again, it was Martha, tough, 75 and barely 5 feet tall, who turned in her booth and said, "If you can't handle looking at strength, sugar, maybe you should eat with your eyes closed." The diner went quiet. The man flushed and muttered an apology. Isabella didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just nodded, wiped the counter clean, and poured another cup of coffee. She never asked for anyone to stand up for her. But when they did, it reminded her that even in this small town of narrow eyes and tighter hearts, something had shifted. She wasn't alone. Not completely. And sometimes, that was enough to carry her through another day. The war never ended for Isabella Cruz. It only changed landscapes. It traded sandstorms for cold wind, gunfire for murmured gossip, and adrenaline for the dull, ever-present hum of emptiness. Coming home wasn't a return. It was a relocation of the battle, this time fought not with weapons, but with memory. The airport had been quiet that day, no flags, no cheers, just the sterile scent of polished tiles and indifferent announcements echoing overhead. She stepped onto American soil with a duffel bag and a discharge form, but part of her had never really left the base in Kandahar. She rented a small apartment above an old hardware store on the edge of town, where the floor creaked like tired bones and the radiator sputtered through winter like a man coughing out his last story. It wasn't much, but it was private. It was quiet. Too quiet sometimes. At night, silence pressed against her like a weight, and she would lie awake staring at the ceiling, tracing the same invisible patterns with her eyes, just to feel like she was still moving, still alive. She didn't hang anything on the walls. No photos. No past. Just bare space and a bed that never quite felt like hers. Civilian life was filled with moments that felt absurdly fragile. Crossing streets without scanning rooftops. Sitting in a coffee shop with her back exposed. The first time she jumped at a car backfiring, a child in the parking lot laughed. But Isabella didn't laugh. Her hands trembled as she picked up her groceries from the ground, heart hammering like she was still under fire. She hated that. Not just the fear, but the shame. Shame at being afraid. Shame at being seen. The VA appointments were routine at first, but sterile. A parade of polite nods and checklists, questions that grazed the surface, but never sank deep enough to touch the rawness underneath. How are you sleeping? Are you experiencing any intrusive thoughts? Do you feel safe? The answers came automatically, polished and hollow. She learned quickly which words triggered follow-up forms, which ones bought her silence. Saying, "I'm fine," became a kind of armor. Jobs were harder. No one wanted to hire someone whose resume had more bullet points than business skills. Even fewer wanted to hire a woman with visible scars, a 1,000-yard stare, and a past that made them uncomfortable. Isabella took what she could, stocking shelves, cleaning motel rooms, hauling boxes for cash under the table. Then she found May's Diner. It was supposed to be temporary, just a place to earn enough to move on. But something about the repetitive rhythm of it, the sizzle of bacon, the clink of ceramic, the murmur of old couples and truckers, offered a strange kind of stability. Predictable, mundane, safe. She worked long hours. The diner's fluorescent lights washed over her scars until even she forgot to flinch at her reflection. Her hands, which once steadied rifles, now poured coffee with mechanical grace. Some days were easier than others. There were mornings she could almost pretend she was just like everyone else, until a sudden slam or a sharp whistle would jolt her nerves like a live wire, and her body remembered what her mind was trying to forget. She didn't talk much about her time overseas. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't know how to speak about it without sounding like she was reliving it. People ask sometimes, curious, or just pretending to care, but when she saw the discomfort in their eyes, the way their expressions tightened like they wanted to hear the story but not the pain, she would shut it down with a tight smile and a vague, "I did what I had to do." There were flashbacks. Not always vivid, not always violent, but persistent. They came in sensations. The smell of diesel. The flash of sunlight off a windshield. The feel of coarse sand caught in the hem of her pants. Memory wasn't linear. It was scattered, fragmented, like glass broken on the floor. You never knew which piece you'd step on next. And yet, she found ways to live. She took long walks at dusk, when the town was quiet and the sky turned the color of old bruises. She adopted a stray cat that wouldn't let her touch it for weeks, then curled up on her chest one night like it had always belonged there. She planted basil on her windowsill and watched it die twice before learning how much sunlight it needed. She read old detective novels from the library and drank cheap wine on Sundays. There were no grand revelations, no miraculous healings, just a slow, stubborn resilience that built itself one breath at a time. Isabella never became whole again because wholeness was a myth. But she became real, present, a woman who had learned to live with ghosts rather than bury them. She carried her past like a second skin, visible, undeniable, but no longer in control. And in a world that preferred tidy endings, she chose instead to keep living inside the messy middle, because survival, for her, was not a triumph. It was a quiet, daily defiance. It started with a message on her old military email, one she hadn't checked in over a year. The subject line read, "Reunion, Echo Unit, Camp Pendleton. You in?" Her hand hovered over the delete key. She stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a pulse in the silence. It wasn't the message itself that unsettled her, but the names listed underneath. Some she hadn't thought of in years. Some she thought she'd never want to see again. And one name, Staff Sergeant Joel Harlan, sent a shiver down her spine. They had all come home, scattered like broken pieces of the same machine, living different lives, but linked by that irreversible bond of shared war. She hadn't spoken to most of them since the day they stood in formation for the last time, boots aligned, faces unreadable, trying to memorize each other's silhouettes before life swallowed them whole. They had promised to stay in touch. Promises made with good intentions and heavy fatigue. Promises no one really believed. And yet, 2 weeks later, she found herself driving down the coast toward San Diego. The closer she got, the more the road seemed to pull memories from her like threads unraveling. She remembered the sound of boots on tarmac, the sting of sand in her eyes, Harlan's voice barking orders, Darnell's laugh in the middle of a blackout. Echo Unit hadn't just been a unit. They were her family, the only one that understood who she had become. Or who she had tried to be. The reunion was held at a local VFW hall, a squat building with faded flags and a parking lot half filled with pickup trucks. She sat in her car for a long time before going in, watching familiar silhouettes move behind the glass. Her reflection stared back at her in the rearview mirror, older, harder, unsure. She finally opened the door when she saw Darnell come out to smoke, his laughter still loud, still contagious. That laugh had saved her more times than she could count. Inside, time seemed to collapse. There were handshakes and backslaps, clumsy hugs, and eyes that didn't quite meet. The room smelled like cheap beer and old leather. Names came with stories, some funny, some broken. There was Ramos, who now coached high school football and hadn't picked up a rifle since. Lee, who ran a tattoo shop and still wore the same silver cross she did back then. And Harlan, still broad, still calm, with a deeper sadness behind his eyes. They talked about deployments like war stories from a different life, laughed too hard at things that weren't really funny, paused too long when the names of the dead came up. Isabella felt herself split in two, one part slipping easily back into the rhythm of her old brothers in arms, the other watching from a distance, like a ghost revisiting the living. Some of them had healed, or at least stitched themselves together. Others hadn't. You could see it in the way they flinched when a bottle dropped, or stared too long at nothing. Later, when most had left, a few of them remained outside under a flickering street lamp. No one said much at first. The silence wasn't awkward, it was understood. They were waiting for who would break first, for who would say the thing they were all afraid to voice. It was Harlan who finally spoke. "We did what we had to do," he said, not looking at anyone. "But damn, it cost us more than I think any of us expected." Darnell nodded, flicking his cigarette into the gravel. "Yeah. Came home with medals and nightmares. Some trade." Isabella didn't speak. Her throat was tight. There were too many things she wanted to say, too many wounds that had never been named, let alone closed. She thought about the day she'd found Peterson, barely breathing after stepping on that pressure plate. She thought about the letters she had never sent to his mother, about the nights she wondered why she was the one who made it back. That night, back in her motel room, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. But this time, the silence felt different. Heavier, but shared. The reunion hadn't healed her. It hadn't healed any of them. But it had reminded her that she wasn't alone in the aftermath. That there were others out there carrying the same invisible weight. A few days later, she received a group message. A private forum. Just the unit. No therapists. No filters. Just them. She hesitated for a long moment, then typed her first message. "Still here. Still trying. You?" One by one, replies came in. Brief. Honest. Raw. Not all of them were okay, but they were still trying. And that, in its own way, was enough. It wasn't closure. It wasn't peace. But it was a beginning. The town didn't change overnight. Most places never do. But something shifted, subtle at first, like the easing of a clenched jaw or the loosening of a knot you didn't know had been tied around your chest. After the reunion, word began to spread. Not from Isabella herself. She never spoke of it directly, but from the murmurs of those who'd seen her there, standing among the other Marines, her name spoken with a kind of quiet reverence that hadn't existed before. People in the diner started looking at her differently. It wasn't dramatic. No grand apologies. Just softer eyes. Longer pauses. A hesitation before judgment. Mr. Halloran, who once complained about her tattoos and called her unladylike, now left double the tip and asked about her garden basil. A local teacher she'd never spoken to before came in with a stack of high school essays about unsung heroes and asked if Isabella might read them. The way she looked at Isabella, not with pity, but with something resembling respect, felt strange. Disarming. She didn't trust it at first. Years of ridicule and invisible walls had taught her that kindness often came with strings. But these weren't grand gestures. They were small, almost clumsy attempts to connect. The mayor stopped by one morning, awkward in a suit that didn't quite fit, and thanked her for her service. He called her Sergeant Cruz, like the title carried weight again, like it belonged to her, not just to the war. And maybe for the first time it did. The change in tone caught Isabella off guard more than the judgment ever had. She had built her identity on surviving in spite of the world, not being embraced by it. Acceptance had never been the goal. Survival was. But now that the world around her softened, she found herself confronting the more difficult question: what happens after survival? What does it mean to live when the fight no longer defines you? She began speaking more. Not about the details. Those remained locked in the silence between scar tissue and memory, but about the truth of living after war. About grief. About guilt. About the slow, grueling process of rebuilding a sense of self in a world that no longer mirrored who you became in uniform. A local reporter asked for an interview. She declined at first, but then offered to write her own piece, an essay not about combat but about coming home, about the cost of invisibility. When it was published, the response was overwhelming, not because it was eloquent but because it was honest. Her story made space for others. A Vietnam vet came into the diner and left a newspaper clipping of his old platoon, folded neatly next to a $10 tip. A young woman training for the Air Force asked to speak with her after hours. Even the local high school invited her to a career day, not to talk about war, but about resilience. The girl who once hid her scars behind sleeves now rolled them up. Not for display, but for ease. For honesty. She didn't stop having nightmares. She didn't stop flinching when someone raised their voice. But she stopped apologizing for it. And somehow, in that refusal to shrink, the community began to grow around her. Not perfectly. Not always. But genuinely. She was no longer the ghost in the diner. No longer just the damaged woman who returned with nothing but silence and an iron spine. She was Isabella Cruz. Marine. Survivor. Storyteller. The quiet woman who made the best black coffee in town and could still, if she had to, field strip an M4 with her eyes closed. And one morning, while watching the sunrise wash the diner windows in gold, she realized something that startled her with its simplicity. She belonged. Not because they finally accepted her, but because she no longer needed them to in order to exist. Her worth had never been contingent on recognition. It had only waited for her to reclaim it. The war had shaped her. The silence had scarred her. But the truth, the raw, complicated truth, had finally given her a place not just to stand, but to stay. The meaning didn't come to Isabella all at once. It didn't arrive with fanfare or some epiphany neatly wrapped in words. It came quietly, the way healing often does, like breath returning to lungs you forgot had been holding air for too long. It came in the mundane. The sound of the diner door chime, the routine clink of ceramic against ceramic, the sudden realization that laughter didn't sound foreign anymore. It came in her own reflection, how she no longer flinched from the woman she saw in the mirror. This wasn't a story about war. It wasn't even a story about coming home. It was about something far more fragile, far more human. It was about the long, messy journey of reclaiming identity in a world that tried to erase it. Isabella had spent years wrapped in silence, wearing the uniform of survival, but never the skin of peace. What made her story matter wasn't that she endured what others couldn't see, but that she kept choosing to live with what remained. That she walked into her own shadows and didn't let them swallow her. The town had once reduced her to whispers and sideways glances, turning her into a symbol of discomfort, a reminder that heroism often comes back broken, that not every return is triumphant. But in time, her presence forced a reckoning. She didn't need pity. She didn't want validation. What she needed, what she ultimately gave herself, was permission. Permission to be more than the war, more than the scars, more than the version of her people assumed. The meaning of Isabella's life was stitched into the quiet rebellion of persistence. She didn't transform through dramatic gestures or cinematic closure. She changed by waking up every morning and refusing to disappear, by speaking even when her voice trembled, by staying even when her instinct told her to run. In a world obsessed with dramatic endings and clean victories, she lived a truth far more honest. Healing doesn't erase pain. It teaches you how to carry it with grace. Her story was for those who came home and found nothing familiar, for For the women told they were too much or never enough. For the ones who carry the silence of trauma in their bodies and still find a way to hold kindness in their hands. It was for anyone who's ever had to rebuild themselves from the rubble of someone else's expectations. Isabella never became a symbol. She remained flesh and bone, with bad knees and a crooked smile, and a mind that still played old footage in the dark. But she was whole. Not flawless. Not untouched. But whole, in the way only the truly broken can become when they stop trying to be the person they were before everything changed. And maybe that was the point of it all. Not to go back, but to go forward. Not to be who she used to be, but to honor who she became through the fire. Hers was not a happy ending in the traditional sense. It was something rarer. It was real. And in the realness, raw, unvarnished, and quietly defiant, lay the story's deepest meaning. That survival is not weakness. That visibility is power. That telling the truth of your pain can become a kind of freedom, not just for yourself, but for others walking the same unseen road. And that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is stay.